Good morning.
Good morning. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Roger Smith, the chair of the Executive Committee of the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism, here to welcome you to our 7th annual conference. This year's theme has been social rights and citizenship, and today we turn to the theme of labor rights in the 21st century, the rights of work, and it's appropriate to be doing it now. 70 years ago, in his 1944 State of the Union speech, Franklin Roosevelt returned to a theme that he had announced even when he first ran for president in 1932, calling for what he called a second economic Bill of Rights. He said, "In our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education, and more." Through this year, we have been exploring the status of various social rights in the 21st century, including all of the topics just referred to, because the status of these rights that Roosevelt regarded as self-evident in 1944, rights which came in one way or another subsequently to be encoded in many international documents propagated by the new United Nations, rights that were celebrated by T.H. Marshall in his subsequent address on citizenship and social rights, a social class, in which he argued that these kinds of social rights serve to balance out the inevitable inequalities of a capitalist society. The confidence that these sorts of social rights are self-evident has clearly been shaken, if not rejected, in many parts of the world in the 21st century. These kinds of social rights, including rights to a job, with government as an employer of last resort, and a job that provides a living wage, these sorts of rights came to be associated with what were viewed as failed economic policies, especially after the fall of communism. And we have had in the past generation a wave of new policies thought to be particularly more effective in generating jobs as well as economic growth and job creation that have shaped national and international economic policies in many of the economies of the world, including the United States, Western Europe, and much more. And the results of these transformations, usually placed under the heading of neoliberalism, very much disputed. Certainly the consequences for labor, both for the fate of organized labor and for the accessibility of much of the workforce to employment with a living wage. These are not labor conditions that can be said to be flourishing, but the sources of change, the prospects for improvement, very much in dispute. And the conference today brings together scholars from different disciplines and different continents in order to reflect on different dimensions of these labor issues. I should pause at this point to note that our program for the year was put together by a superb planning committee headed by my colleague in political science, Professor Julie Lynch, also including Mark Stern of the School of Social Policy and Planning, Emily Hannum of Sociology, Cynthia Connolly of Nursing, with Philippe Bourgois of Anthropology, Michael Katz of History, and me serving in ex officio capacities of various sorts. And I think you will understand in a conference concerned with economic issues that I also want to announce that the DCC program is generously supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Mary and David Boyce Family Fund, as well as receiving great support from the Penn administration. Due to various logistical matters, Julie Lynch and I have decided to switch chairing the first panel. So in addition to welcoming you, I am introducing the first panel, which addresses labor rights and welfare rights in Western Europe. And we have two excellent scholars to present. We will begin with Antje Schwinnecke, who is the postdoctoral fellow this year in the Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism program, originally from Germany. Her doctorate is from Indiana University, and her research concerns the politics of changing welfare policies in Western Europe. And I want to note that Antje has worked with me throughout the year with the DCC undergraduate grant recipients, doing a superb job while offering her own highly successful seminar that included introducing a service learning component into the DCC program for the first time, where she had students actively working on with organizations on some of the kinds of social problems that are the subject of her research. And our other presenter will be Jonathan Hopkin, who is, in the delightful British terminology, reader in comparative politics in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. He is also a prolific writer of comparative politics with considerable attention to political party systems in Spain, in Italy, in Britain, in Western Europe, but with recurrent attention to the role of labor organizations and labor parties in those political processes. And our discussant is Roberto Iverson from the School of Social Policy and Practice, who has examined many related issues in an American context, and also has the breadth to reach across the pond today. Our procedure throughout the day will be to have the speakers speak for roughly 20, we're not draconian about it, but certainly no more than 25 minutes, discussants 15 to 20 minutes. Antje will open the program with her paper on the labor market policy preferences of insiders and outsiders, accounting for changes over time.
Thank you. Do we have a clicker, or should I be over there? What's the...
Matt knows.
Matt knows that. I can be over there.
We need a clicker later.
You need to present now.
That's like I'll be over there. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for coming and listening to my presentation. Very happy to be here. I'm very fortunate that I had the opportunity to be the postdoctoral fellow for the DCC program this year. And I'm excited to present my project. This is very much a project that's in progress, so I apologize already for the lack of, well, the shortcomings that it still has. It's not necessarily, labor rights isn't necessarily the area I work in when I started in the DCC program, so I'm still learning about this, and I think I have a very good idea. I think it's going to fit very well into the the book project that's going to come out of this. But I'm still at the beginning of it. So I'll let you know what I'm planning to do, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and your comments if you have any. I think it'll be really happy as I move forward with this. So the topic today is the labor market policy preferences of insiders and outsiders accounting for changes over time. So the erosion of labor rights has happened in Europe in light of post-industrialization and flexibilization of European labor markets. And the broader political context in which these changes have taken place has been identified as dualization and the development of labor market insider and outsider divides in European markets as one of the broader political contexts. And the literature on this, for example, Schwander and Häusermann, 2013, Amenegger, King and Rueda. And Rueda is really the person who's been very prominent about this insider-outsider divide. So I'm going to draw on his work, but especially the newer definition of insiders, labor market insiders and outsiders by Schwander and Häusermann in their piece in 2013. So the questions I'm hoping to answer for this project, but also the way I'm going to take it forward for the chapter, how do policy preferences differ between labor market insiders and outsiders in advanced industrial democracies? What do they look like in 10 advanced industrial democracies in 1990 to 2006? And what are the implications, possible implications for labor rights? So my theory is that, or my thought is that if we know how these preferences for labor market policies differ between insiders and outsiders, and then eventually compare that to which political party is paying more attention when they position themselves in terms of labor market policies to which group, we can get a sense of the development of labor market policies and labor rights in the future, depending on the development of groups, preferences, and how parties react to them. So the concept of insiders and outsiders, which is one of the innovations of this project that I'm doing, is that the way I conceptualize them is as groups within the workforce that are at higher risk of being atypically employed or unemployed compared to the average workforce. So the idea is that it's not just the temp or the work status at a certain point in time. So whether or not you're unemployed now or employed right now when the survey is taken, if this is public opinion data, but it's the risk that's associated with being in a certain class, of a certain gender, of a certain age within society that influences how you perceive what your preferences are and how you perceive this risk. And so instead of saying, well, I'm employed right now, but I might not be in 3 months, it's the risk of being unemployed that changes or influences your preferences. And this is based on the work of Schwander and Häusermann. So the preferences for policies are shaped by the individual's expectations and perceptions regarding their future risk of unemployment. And it's a better measure than employment status at a particular time point, because employment status can be very volatile, so people can move in and out of it faster than their preferences would change. And I think the risk and perception of that risk is more stable in terms of determining these groups and whether or not you feel like an insider or an outsider of the labor market. So I also want to specify, this is a comment I already got from Bobby Everson, that insiders and outsiders here are not conceptualized in terms of immigrants, for example, immigrant populations in European countries. It really is about certain groups, occupational groups, combined with gender and age, regardless of immigration status, for example. So the measurement of insiders and outsiders is based on occupations in post-industrial class groups, and this is based on the conceptualization of Schwander and Häusermann, and I combine that with gender and age. And they classify 17 occupational groups, which are low service functionaries, that's LSF, blue-collar workers, mixed service functionaries, and then social cultural professionals and capital accumulators. And those groups are coded based on, in the actually data, and that data based on ISCO codes. And then I combine those with gender and age. So for example, you would have the group of low service functionaries, younger women, or blue collar workers, older men. And those are the groups. And then I would calculate the risk of being unemployed or in atypical work based on comparing the unemployment or atypical employment of that group to the average workforce in that year in that country. And if they're significantly different, so if this group is at higher risk of being unemployed than the average workforce in that year and in that country, then I would term them an outsider. And so then I develop a dichotomous measure of insiders and outsiders based on their risk of being unemployed or typically employed in a certain country year. The preferences then, and this is where it's very much work in progress, the preferences would be, I would look at the preferences of each group, so of insider and outsider group in a country in a given year. And then to see if the preferences of insiders and outsiders differ. I have a lot more questions than 3 repeated questions, and I try to do this. Anybody who does research with data, I'm just gonna, plea for your understanding. But I worked very hard on this and tried to do it last minute to get something together. But basically, I have more than 3 repeated questions. This was the latest consensus that I thought I could do. But it turns out the samples weren't big enough to actually come up with meaningful comparisons. So I have to go back. But I have, for my book project that I've been working on this year, I have 18 questions regarding social policy over 10 countries between 1985 and 2006. So that's the data set I'm going to be drawing on. I have all the groups already classified that I just mentioned, so the different occupational groups, gender and age, and I'm going to look at and I have the unemployment data too. I'm going to look at the rate of unemployment, identify them as insiders or outsiders, and then look at their policy preferences. I just cannot present you the data right now because I couldn't get it done. I ran out of time. I didn't lose the game, I just ran out of time. So I'm going to work on it. So the questions are recoded as the percentage of left responses out of left plus right responses. So it's this idea similar to the mood policy mood that James Stimson codes for the United States, which is basically saying how do preferences move from left to right over time, and I'm going to be able to do that for labor market preferences between the different groups, between insiders and outsiders. So these are the questions that I was hoping to present to you today, but just so you can get an idea of the questions for labor market preferences. These are from the International Social Survey Program. And they're actually more years than just 96 and 2006. So eventually I'm going to be able to do, for example, for this question, 1985, 90, 96, and 2006. So it'll be a pretty good time series. The reason why I couldn't do it right now is because the ISCO coding before 1991 is all over the place in the data, so I'm going to need more time to actually recode it and get it in the right occupational groups. But it's something that definitely can be done. So this question is, on the whole, do you think it should be or should not be the government's responsibility to provide a decent standard of living for the unemployed? Another question would be, on the whole, do you think it should be or should not be the government's responsibility to provide a job for everyone who wants one? And another example would be, please show whether you would like to see more or less government spending in each area. Remember that if you say much more, it might require a tax increase to pay for it, unemployment benefits. So that's the example of questions. I have 5 questions that are very much labor market policies. The additional 13 questions I have in my data set are more generally the sentiment towards social policy. So for my project, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring all of those questions together to see if there's a difference between the preferences generally towards social policy between insiders and outsiders, and then also to see if that differs from the preferences for specifically labor market policies. Okay, so as I said, I'm sorry I can't present any data. I was trying to put it together last minute, and I do have yes, I ran out of time. But the next steps, basically what I want to do for this chapter is not just show how the preferences differ between the different groups, insiders and outsiders, and I will also be able to talk about the compilation of insiders and outsider groups over time in 10 different countries. So what do they look like? What groups, how have the composition of the groups changed, of insiders and outsiders changed? Have they grown size? So those are all implications that I can draw from my data. And then what I'd like to do is include, so right now the data in the International Social Survey program only has unemployment, so I'm going to include atypical employment in the measure. I'm going to add data, national data to it. This is what Schwander and Hauserman did too for the countries that weren't in their data set. So for Australia, the US, and Canada, they added national survey data in order to complete the data points for risk. So I'm going to do that. I know it sounds like a lot, but I know what I'm doing, so I am very confident that I can get this done. And then I'm going to, so for my book project, what I did is I combined the different questions, the 18 different questions, into one measure called social policy mood over time, using the algorithm that Jim Stimson uses in his Public Opinion in America. And so this is what I'm going to do for this one too. I'm going to feed them all together. For the book project, I'm splitting up by voter groups. For this, I'm going to split it up by insiders and outsiders. So I'm going to have time series between 85 and 2006 to see how the preferences of these two groups matter. And then I want to relate them to party positions. So when this project is done, what I'm hoping to do is not just to see how preferences change over time, but which preferences actually get heard by the political parties, and if the different groups get what they want, basically, and what implications that could have for labor rights. So that's what I have for you today. So I'd be very happy to hear any comments at this early stage of the project. Thank you.
Do you think you'll want it quicker, or?
I'm probably okay with this.
Okay.
Thanks. Right. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming to hear this. I should point out, it's disappointing for you all, but I am no longer a reader. We have gone American. I am now an associate professor, so unfortunately, you know, these little national differences are gradually fading away. Is it all about globalization? I don't know, but I guess what I'm trying to say in this little talk, it's not really a paper as yet, is I'm trying to challenge some of the sort of lazier interpretations of how policy has responded to the financial crisis in Europe particularly, which have tended to imply that set of policy choices have been made which are kind of more or less imposed. There's not much choice involved by global economic conditions. Especially drawing on a lot of comment by economists rather than political scientists that maybe there were other policy choices that could have been made, and especially Mark Blythe's hard-hitting book Austerity, which I advise you all to read, which suggests that a lot of these policy choices are not only insane but also driven more by ideological obsessions than by any rational policy process. I think it's time to sort of think about why it is that the choices that have been made came about. So what I'll do in this talk, and I have my phone is timing me here, so hopefully I can come in around 20 minutes, is to just give you a snapshot of the state of social Europe after the financial crisis. The brief version is it's pretty bad. Look a little bit, quite superficially, at the kind of policy measures that have been adopted at the European level, but also at nation-state level. Try and look at what the possible explanations for these choices are, and suggest some critical comments on those explanations, and if I have time, speculate about the future. That's probably the bit to leave out when I run out of time, because of course making predictions, especially about the future, is always a bad move for a social scientist. Okay, so Here is a little chart of GDP, change in GDP between 2008, when the financial crisis really sort of hit home, and 2013, the latest data we have. There has actually been a little bit of growth of GDP, but this is not annual. This is for the whole 5-year period, right? This is not an annual growth rate. This is 5-year growth. So the European Union has grown 2.8% since then. The Eurozone 2.4%. The German economy has grown 7.3% over that 5-year period, but look at the other, I've picked out the most obvious disaster zones of Europe, which are the southern European countries, periphery countries. We include Ireland in that. Greece's GDP has contracted by 16.4%. Ireland, pretty terrible too, although Ireland's often presented as being the poster child of how austerity measures and economic reform would produce recovery. Its GDP is still 11.2% below what it was in 2008. And also, I didn't put Britain down there, but Britain is also still with a smaller, this is GDP per capita, by the way, still has smaller GDP per capita than it did in before the crisis, before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, at least in 2008. So that's the broad economic context. It's terrible, right? We haven't seen anything like that since the Great Depression. Certainly the crises of the 70s and early 80s were nowhere near as deep and prolonged. Unemployment is obviously one of the key areas affecting social rights, and you can see here the picture, apart from in Germany, is of regression, right? We have unemployment going up. It's gone down in Germany, but it's gone up in the European Union as a whole. It's still averaging 10.8% across the EU. That's a whole EU 28, by the way. I should have put data for the Eurozone in there. And you can see colossal increases in countries like Greece and Spain, also pretty big in Portugal, Ireland, and Italy. So these are overall unemployment rates. If we look at youth unemployment, then in some of the southern countries, we're talking up figures between 60 and 70% youth unemployment. This is simply catastrophic. I don't really need to go into any more detail at that. Population at risk of poverty and social exclusion, which is a rather complicated definition that Eurostat comes up with, but it combines income, relative income measures and some other indicators. It has gone. These are in raw, absolute numbers, millions of people. So in Germany there's been a slight fall, but everywhere else it's gone up. Actually, quite striking is that Italy, which has not had one of the deepest contractions in GDP. It's still been pretty bad, but not as bad as Greece and Spain, but has had a bigger increase in socially excluded population. And part of the reason for that is that Italy actually, more than the other countries, adopted austerity right from the start, had barely any stimulus package, really, and has taken a very, despite its reputation, a very rigorous fiscal line. And the consequences are another 3 million people out of a population of 60 million at risk of poverty and social exclusion. So it's pretty bad. Economic stagnation, very, very slow recovery, actually no recovery in some of the periphery countries as yet. Every quarter we see a little glimmer of hope somewhere. It's a PMI or unemployment or something. Unemployment's growing more slowly than it was the last quarter, but so far, apart from in Germany, the picture is pretty good. And it's also worth pointing out that even some countries like the Netherlands, which we consider as part of the rich north, are still also below their GDP in 2008. It's actually only really Germany and a couple of other kind of satellite countries which have grown at all. So there's a big divergence within Europe in growth rates. And although the data is hard to come by systematically, but we have early indications that there have been significant increases in inequality of income distribution in some of the southern countries in particular over this 5-year period. We know in the longer period it's gone up just about everywhere. Big generational inequalities, so a lot of the policy measures taken have tended to penalise younger citizens whilst protecting, relatively speaking, older core protected workers and pensioners in particular. And we see also a loss of a lot of the policy autonomy that national governments may have enjoyed in the past to do much about this. And there have been measures taken which have eroded labour and welfare rights. So things are looking pretty miserable. What have governments and the European Union done about this? Well, first of all, we have to consider that there is a bit of a difference between EU countries which are in the Eurozone and those who are outside. This split actually provides us methodologically with a useful tool to try and figure out what the real reasons for policy choices are. My main interests are Britain, where I live, and Italy, where I would like to live. And and I spend a lot of time in both countries. And it's actually quite interesting that the policy choices made are not starkly different between these two countries, even though Britain is not in the Eurozone, has not been told to do any of the things it's currently doing by the European Commission. In fact, if there's one good way to get Britain to do something, is for the European Commission to tell them to do the opposite. So we can see actually there are common patterns in policy which are not driven just by the euro itself. Okay, so I probably shouldn't go into too much detail here. Essentially, the broad approach has been what we could, the broadest concept is austerity, right? So there's been no real, there were initially stimulus measures. Jonas Pontusson and Damien Rice have written a paper on this in the Annual Review of Political Science a couple of years back, which detailed some of the stimulus responses in the early phase of the crisis. But since 2010, there's been a reversion to much more orthodox strategies. So very limited counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy. And an increasingly tight control, especially within the Eurozone, on government's ability to run fiscal deficits, and through the various measures, the fiscal compact, six-pack, and so on. Pressure on countries not only to avoid running deficits, but also to reduce overall levels of debt. And let's remember that one of the reasons why countries have high levels of debt is because of some of the measures they had to take to bail out financial institutions and to deal with the recession caused by the collapse of the financial markets. So that's the fiscal side, and the other side has been to encourage the periphery countries, the Eurozone, to adjust their economies by effectively cutting real wages. And because the inflation rate is pretty low, actually some of the southern countries are now actually heading towards deflation, as well as some northern European countries that have brought it upon themselves, like Sweden. So we have a deflation risk, which of course makes dealing with debt much more difficult and makes wage adjustment much more difficult for kind of obvious reasons. Nobody likes a 10% pay cut, but they can deal with a pay freeze if there's 10% inflation. And so this is a strategy, what we could call internal devaluation, which is plus fiscal contraction, which has been imposed by the European policymakers. And so far it doesn't seem to be doing any of the countries that are in most trouble an awful lot of good. There have been bailout measures, obviously, and there have been various loans and guarantees made to some of the struggling states, particularly Ireland, Greece and Portugal, but also Spain. Italy so far has avoided a direct bailout. But these impose strict policy conditions which all tend to, again, erode government's ability to use its own fiscal levers to try and affect the economy and affect the distribution of income. And they've also pushed these countries into making reforms which tend to erode labour and social rights. So this is the EU level of policy. I probably don't have time to read all this out, but there are a few sort of statements which more or less lay bare what it is that the European Union would like countries to do. This nice letter from the two central bankers, the ECB, to Berlusconi in August 2001, effectively telling Berlusconi, amongst other things, to reform the Italian labour market and to get rid of a lot of labour protections that core Italian workers enjoy. Core Italian insiders, of course. The insider-outsider distinction here is quite relevant. Now, the interesting thing is that we know the EU has made a bunch of choices, and we know a lot of the backstory behind that. But it's also interesting to look at national-level responses, because not all of the policy response has been driven by European pressures. And I'll skip over this quickly because I want to get to the possible explanations. But if we take the UK and Sweden, these are brilliant cases, actually, of countries that have adopted, although Sweden had initially stronger stimulus, well, Britain also too, before the election of the Conservative government in 2010, adopted stimulus measures, but since have adopted austerity and without significant pressure from financial markets, they've adopted fiscal contraction measures. Okay, so at the national level, what I'm essentially the point to make here is that there's a commonality of response even beyond those parts of the policy response which are driven by European Union pressures. And there's been a lot of pressure, especially on the southern countries, to adopt labour market reforms, in part as a component of the conditionality of some of the bailout measures. So we've seen labour market reforms in Greece, Spain, Portugal and Italy over the 2010 to 12 period. And there's still further pressure to take these reforms further, to remove some of the restrictions on firing that are a part of the labour regime of these countries and so on. And also to push towards increasingly decentralised wage setting, which is it's quite a big deal in Southern Europe because through various extension agreements, wage increases tend to be spread evenly across the economy, which has an effect, obviously, of evening out the income distribution, which in these countries is actually quite unequal by international standards. So they're pushing to actually reduce the centralisation of wage setting and to allow much greater dispersion of wages, which of course is going to lead to greater inequality and is not going to be backed up by measures using welfare policy to counteract the inequalities resulting from that. So why have we done all this? And I have 7 minutes to tell you about these possible explanations. 4 categories, essentially. There's a classic economic explanation, a more institutional one about constraints of the EU policy framework, an ideational explanation, which would draw on work by people like Mark Blyth, which suggests that it's all about because we've become neoliberal and believe these crazy ideas. And then finally, my own sort of spin on this, which is that there's also a political, electoral, party politics dimension to these choices. So, I'll do this one quite quickly because in a sense this is the standard story and probably doesn't require too much detail, but essentially, we've done all these. Austerity was a policy choice imposed by reality, right? Material reality makes us do these things because if we don't cut budgets, then bond markets will go crazy and the world will end. There is also a possibly more refined version of this, which is that when it comes to the imbalances that have been generated in the Eurozone, Southern Europe has ended up with higher real wages, real exchange rates than it needs to be internationally competitive, and therefore there needs to be some kind of wage adjustment. And therefore, as a result of all these things, there is only, the logical policy to follow is to cut debts so that financial markets don't get spooked. Those financial markets, let's remember, that only actually currently exist because of government intervention. And we have to slash labour rights because otherwise workers won't allow their wages to settle at levels which make countries competitive. The thing is, I'm not an economist. All I can say is that a lot of smart economists suggest that these policies are not necessarily the only ones that could be followed. Nobel Prize winners and numerous Nobel Prize winners have said, this is all nuts. I'll stop there, right? I mean, there's nothing much I can add to what people like Krugman and Stiglitz and so on say. They may be wrong, okay? I'm not saying they're necessarily right. But the point is that there is a debate. And if you follow economics blogs, which is one of the only positive consequences of the financial crisis, is the explosion of economics debate on blogs, which makes it accessible to people like me who are not very good at maths. And, there is a debate out there. And therefore, the idea that there's no real alternative to the policy mix that's being followed just simply doesn't fit with the reality of the intellectual climate in the economics profession and outside. Okay, so having dealt with globalization and economic constraints, is it all about institutions? Well, we signed up to the European Union. I borrowed this, by the way, from my colleague David Woodruff, who some of you might know, who came up with this great idea, kind of twist on the Ulysses and the Sirens metaphor used a lot to talk about credible commitments, that, actually Europe now finds itself tied to the mast while the ship is sinking, right? It's tied itself into these measures which are designed to combat the ghost of inflation, and suddenly it turns out the real problem is deflation, but, we're tied into these policies because that's what we decide to do. We're locked into them. But of course, the history of the European Union is a history of responding to crises by changing the institutions, right? So that, for a start, I don't think is that compelling. And actually, the EU has made a lot of institutional changes since the financial crisis, but they're all changes which have followed a particular pattern. And again, given that there were policy choices available, the fact that they made the choices they have, the institutions have been adapted in the way they have, suggests that there's an underlying political story that we need to pay attention to. So both of these, the institutional and the economic arguments, sort of suggest some kind of inevitability about austerity and about the erosion of social rights. And I'm suggesting here basically that I don't think it is, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that there were no policy choices or institutional choices that could be made. So there is an ideational story, an ideological story, if you like, here, which is associated by people like Mark Blyth, but also Paul Krugman, despite being a mainstream economist, is now increasingly interested in these kind of arguments. Of course, John Quiggin wrote a fantastic book, which I advise you all to read if you haven't already, which is called Zombie Economics, about a series of powerful economic ideas which have essentially been pretty much falsified by the evidence and experience, but which still are being clung on to by policymakers, especially in Europe, as it happens. So there are a lot of interesting things you can say with this sort of ideational institutionalist or sort of constructivist approach. And I have a lot of sympathy with this approach. I think the financial crisis has proved that a lot of the time policymakers do stick with existing policy paradigms, even when the evidence is screaming out to them that the world has changed. But what I'd like to add to this particular angle is that we need to understand the politics of why particular ideas survive in the face of the evidence and why sometimes they change. Because, of course, the ideas debate, for those of you who've followed it, you will know, a lot of the debate about the role of political ideas in economic policy stemmed out of observation of what happened in the 70s and 80s, when there was a shift away from the kind of collectivist, state interventionist approach used in most Western countries in the post-war period towards a more neoliberal paradigm. And, that's, a lot of what happened in the 70s was that a series of crises, political, economic crises, were exploited to shift the sort of ideological terrain of the policy debate. But of course, that crisis, I grew up in the 1970s in Britain, which had the highest inflation rate in Europe, and apparently there were so many strikes that, nothing basically happened in Britain for 10 years in the 1970s. And I remember growing up in the 70s, I can't really remember life being so bad, actually. But then again, I was a kid, what do you know? But actually, in Britain, things in the average growth rate in Britain in the 1970s was about 2.5%, right? Things weren't that bad. They were bad enough to justify a shift in the political debate, but they were not, again, it's not the logic of no alternative. There were policy alternatives that could have been adopted. Other countries adopted different policy mixes with different consequences for social rights. And, the fact that policy choices were made was not the result of some kind of logical response to an economic failure. So instead, I think we need to start paying attention to how it is that different ideas are mobilized by political organizations, right? And here I'm drawing on the work of people like Hacker and Pearson, and with Julie I'm involved in a project trying to look into how winner-take-all politics and the effects of inequality on political mobilization have fed into policy debates in Europe. So in essence, what I'm suggesting here is that the survival of these zombie ideas, as John Quiggin calls them. Oh, there you go. There's my timer telling me to stop just a second after you did. Yeah, you've been much more, showed greater clemency than my iPhone. Thank you. So what I've tried to do is link this shift in the political climate, if you like, to another shift going on, which scholars in political economy are often less aware of, which is a shift in the terrain of party and electoral politics. Over the period since the 70s, we've seen essentially a weakening of the electoral connection, a weakening of the ways in which political elections and political parties constrain and change policy. Political parties have become organizations that have very few members and supporters. Electoral turnout has declined. Parties have become increasingly financially dependent on either the state or commercial interests, and sometimes a mix of both. And some of the kind of institutional supports of social democratic parties, in particular trade unions, obviously, have also weakened in the same period. And so what we've seen is a period in which political parties as vehicles for policy change and as vehicles for articulating broad social interests into policies to defend the interests of the less wealthy majority of the populations, this is just all weakened. It's become less effective at constraining policy, and this has opened up a space for small, well-resourced, wealthy minorities to have increasing influence over the policy process. I mean, partly that is through a classic material interest kind of politics. So, bankers have a lot of money to fund lobbying organizations to ensure that the response to the financial crisis is not, capital ratios of 30% of balance sheets and so on. All these measures which, have been debated in the financial system, and finance banks have plenty of money and plenty of sort of intellectual resources to challenge regulatory change. But it also can be seen more broadly in the fact that rolling back social rights along the lines of labour market reforms and welfare reforms that we've seen, especially in Southern Europe, but in other countries too, have been much easier to do because of the relative weakness of the political forces that used to protect and defend those rights. So we're talking here about the organised left, social democratic and labour parties, associated trade unions in particular. These forces have become noticeably weaker, and they've also increasingly found themselves adopting some of the policy paradigms that I've been so critical of in this presentation and making them their own, and therefore reducing the scope for policy debate in the formal political system. So the irony is that now we get more of a sense of political contestation from the blogs of Nobel Prize-winning economists in Ivy League universities in the United States than we do from trade union movements in continental Europe. And that seems like probably a good sentence on which to close.
So I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to discuss these two very interesting and stimulating papers and thoughts. Both of them, to my mind anyway, provide a nuanced mix of macro-level and micro-level observations around how different European countries have reached or have reacted to the financial crisis. In some ways, I think Schwenike's paper provides us with some historical background to the kinds of things that Jonathan Hopkins examined, in that her data on European social and labor rights will at least cover the period from the mid-1980s to 2006. And then moving sort of forward from there, Hopkins explicitly discussed the European social and labor rights, using data from 2008 on, even also as you have addressed historical consequences as well, and patterns. Then from another perspective, I think Hopkins' paper provides findings on the broad brush aspects of neoliberalism on social welfare policies in the wake of the financial crisis, examining not only economic conditions, but EU level and national level policy responses. And considering that context, Schwenike's paper moves us deeper into individual level experiences in the labor market, kind of providing a granular view and a granular look at how welfare policies pertain differently and inequitably to workers in what she's discussing as outsider versus insider employment positions. And I think, if I understand that correctly, that's a little bit what labor scholars in the US might call standard versus non-standard employment positions. But we can talk about that later. Anyway, Antje's paper presents how different groups are differentially vulnerable to labor market shocks and changes, and especially highlights the challenges for youth and service workers, which are also strongly reflected in the U.S. labor market today, and which Jonathan mentioned as well. Hopkins' findings demonstrate that practically the same patterns that Schwenike discusses persist in some European countries to the present. I think both papers also usefully pose questions about how progressives in the various countries might combat what seems to be an increasingly widespread tendency in European and other Western political regimes to enact neoliberal solutions to financial ills. And as such, I think both papers offer thoughtful directions for policy, for political movements, and for mobilization of public opinion via social media. But taking the papers historically, then I'm going to begin with a few comments on Antje Schwenneke's paper and then pose a couple of questions or things to think about. Not that I expect you to answer this moment, but just in general. And then I'll do the same with Jonathan Hopkins' paper. I'm going to leave the heavy-duty macroeconomic discussion to others in the room and focus on what the panelists had to say about social and labor rights and practices. I acknowledge, of course, that social rights and practices are heavily embedded in the macroeconomy, but also that such rights and practices, I'm going to add that such rights and practices are also embedded in a country's history and its ideology. So positioning myself in this discussion, I have conducted a major 5-year, 5-city ethnographic research project from 1999 to 2004 on low-income families and economic mobility in the U.S. that was funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I recently worked with Penn sociologist Frank Furstenberg on a Russell Sage-funded longitudinal project in which we explored how middle-income families in the two policy environments of Canada and the U.S. experienced and managed and strategized economically during the Great Recession. And I also, for full disclosure, need to mention that I lived in Norway soon after the close vote against joining the European Union. And believe me, the debate was still heated 8 years later in the early 1980s, 10 years later, basically. And according to my friends in the Norwegian parliament, it was pretty clear that the political and ideological arguments took place in the context of the country's newfound economic wealth based because of the oil discoveries in the North Sea, as well as the context of the older generation's still very vivid memories of German occupation in World War II. Those were the really prevailing discourses at the time. Okay, Antje Schwenneke. Sort of a vague, broad comment and then a question. You've described the employment context in the European labor markets as consisting of insiders and outsiders, based on their position in the market. And you have vividly discussed the increase in flexibilization, marginalization, and exclusion compared to previously standard labor rights. So my question is, do you think, this is kind of a long question, I have tried to figure out how to put it, but anyway, do you think that the recent decades of similar employment and labor market shifts in the U.S., and then some examples of these shifts are from manufacturing to service, from hierarchical to flatter management relationships, from more robust to practically non-existent labor union participation, and from increases in the involuntary contingent employment and underemployment. Anyway, those are sort of the recent decades of similar employment and labor market shifts. Do you think that those shifts that preceded the global financial crisis, the latest one anyway, together with the neoliberal social welfare practices in the US and the UK that accompanied these shifts, do you think that those things influenced the increase in neoliberal practices in European countries? Or do you think that the European countries, or some of them anyway, came to these sort of neoliberal solutions on their own? So it's sort of looking at this broader question. Okay, my second comment and question for Antje Schwenneke is that I'm particularly intrigued by your exploration of how the social policy preferences of labor market insiders and outsiders elicit different responses, or may elicit different responses from political parties. And I hope that at least in your chapter, which I will enjoy reading, if you will be able to elaborate further on what you think are the critical mechanisms and pathways for that influence. I'd wonder, for example, how influential a country's leader might be, how influential the populace's ability to mobilize political action might be, or what the role of social media might be in eliciting different political responses, or many other possibilities. So thank you for that good work. Jonathan Hopkins, you posed the following main question in your presentation. Why has Europe responded to the failure of the neoliberal model with neoliberal solutions? And then you then describe differences in the so-called European response, I have that in quotes, by showing post-collapse differences in GDP, unemployment rates, and the population at risk of poverty and social exclusion. In each of those, you note how the German response differed from a group of other smaller European states, looking at both European Union and national level policy responses. Yet you also emphasize that these new inequalities adhere to every European country's response to the financial crisis. So to my understanding, though, the neoliberal turn, even among European social democrats, has been taking place for at least 2 or 3, maybe even 4 decades. And I think particularly of policies in the UK, for example, even though the UK is not technically Europe. So I think sort of a similar historical perspective on neoliberalism is particularly necessary in the US, in which, to my mind, at least some corners have always been neoliberal to some extent, as is evident in our pattern here of formulating residual rather than universal social welfare policies. So I guess my first question is, how are you actually defining the failure of the neoliberal model? Are you referring to reductions in social welfare programs and reductions in employment and hiring policies and benefits? And in addition, what are your thoughts on whether and how some European states exhibited neoliberal philosophies and policies before the recent financial crisis? And then my second question pertains to your discussion of policy responses. Do I understand correctly that as of 2011, Italy offered no unemployment insurance system? There was that quote there? Oh, okay. So I guess I'm curious, really curious about whether you think, in your opinion, has the autonomous Marxist tradition in Italy had no impact on this aspect of work? And what about in France, where the autonomous Marxists are also active? And finally, do you see any possibilities that autonomous Marxist groups could lead progressive labor movements that might combat current neoliberal practices? So, and now I'm going to very momentarily turn the discussion over to the panelists and the audience. I also want to note that, this is my little small piece. While the panel speakers have focused on a particular financial crisis and primarily from a macroeconomic position, I will contend that economic recovery processes are firmly embedded in the historical values, practices, and policies of a country long before any specific recession. So as such, I make a pitch for longitudinal interview-based research, which might contribute additional layers of understanding to the kind of rich information that both of these panelists presented using larger scale data sets. And I think together these sources might enhance ideas about future policy possibilities and directions. And I think an additional way that micro-level data matter is that they can potentially be harnessed in political mobilization and social movement efforts, which are known to, at least in some of the literature, to influence policy. Although views differ among scholars in the US as well as across nations about how much public opinion and also how much what Schwennicke discusses as worker preferences affect policymakers, and emerging literature contends that narratives, such as those from rigorously researched qualitative data that are presented in the form of compelling stories, that those narratives are influential in the policy process. Thank you.
Well, we have a little over 20 minutes for discussion, and so I'll invite the two presenters briefly to respond about these questions, and then we'll open it up.
Okay. I will start then. So thank you very much for your comments. They were very insightful. Actually, and thank you for your presentation too, Jonathan. It's really interesting to see, I think, how eventually all these projects are going to fit well together. I'm going to take some of your comments too, or some of your findings, and comment on that, I think, in my project. So for the first question, do I think that... Can you pull the microphone a little closer? Can people... Okay. So for the first question, if I think the shift towards neoliberal policies in Europe has been influenced by the US or not, it's actually that's my bigger project that I've been working on, so I can answer that question, I think, at least to some extent. What I'm looking at in my book project is the way that party positions on social policies have changed over time and what accounts for these changes. So it's a little broader than just looking at inside and outside of public opinion, but what other factors influence social policy position shift. And so I started with this project, and now I'm going to try to keep it brief, Rogers, by looking at Germany and the UK and the shift towards neoliberal policies by the Labour Party, and in Germany by the SPD, by Gerhard Schröder in the late 1990s, 97, 98. And so what I find is that I can actually, and my sample includes the US too, so the 10 countries that I'm looking at includes the US, Australia, New Zealand, and then 7 European countries, including Germany and the UK. And I find a consistent pattern of what influences position change, which includes the economy and public opinion, so both factors. And the influence shifts actually around that time when we see a shift towards neoliberal policies in the UK and in Germany. So towards the end of the 90s, the influence of the economy shifts from domestic economic condition towards globalization, and for public opinion, the influence of public opinion shifts from party supporters to uncommitted voters. So the group of uncommitted voters has much more influence on the preferences of that group, what the parties do than the traditional party supporters of the Labour Party, for example, or the Social Democratic Party. So yes, I think, I'm not sure, I wouldn't call it Europe is following what the US is doing, but there seems to be something going on at roughly the same time across all of those countries. And I can comment on that, or I will comment on that in my book that's also forthcoming, or I'm working on, still finishing. The mechanism, I think that's a really good question. I'm still working on that, because I think the mechanism of how insiders and outsiders influence party positions is a little different than how voter supporters or uncommitted voters influence party positions. And so I take your suggestions of looking at leaders and the way they mobilize and things like that into consideration. I think that's a good idea, and I still have to figure that out. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so actually, I think the comments you made are quite consistent with the line I would like to go in, because I think there is a strong historical dimension to all of this. I mean, essentially the way I set up the problem is that, you know, we have this push towards what we could broadly call neoliberalism or liberalization, increasing kind of shift away from, you know, direct government interventionism to improve economic performance and to improve the income distribution, or to make it more equal. And then after an accumulation of the policy shifts in this direction, albeit at different paces and to different extents in different countries, you then have this disastrous collapse of the economy. And these same policy ideas come back with even greater strength and vigor. And so that's, you know, so in a sense, I'm very sympathetic with this idea of a more historical kind of approach, because I think what is probably missing from the way I was outlining it there, which you've hinted at, is how exactly these liberalization processes have weakened still further any capacity to respond. And actually, I've been thinking in terms of an older literature, going back to Klaushoff and Wiesenthal and Lindblom, and, you know, this older literature about you know, structural dependence of the state on capital and so on, and the requirements for, you know, systematic collective action to you know, defend worker rights, if we want to use this what sounds these days like very old-fashioned language, right? Which says something in itself. So I think, you know, we need to go back really to some of these discussions that were going on in the 70s and 80s, and see how it is actually that in, you know, the modern neoliberal state, that it's become increasingly difficult for, it's locked in this neoliberal bias in all the policy process. If you look at the British case, it's really remarkable that the crisis, which is, I mean, the British economy is in a terrible mess, and yet the interpretation of the crisis, which has ended up dominating public discussion, is that the reason there was a crisis was not because of a long 30-year-old process of liberalization of financial and other markets, but instead because Labour over 13 years used some of the money creamed off the financial sector to increase social rights a little bit. So instead of saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have, handed the City of London over to international megabanks in the 1980s, instead the interpretation is we shouldn't have taken some of the tax money from the profits made by those banks to increase pension rights and give poor paid workers tax credits. That's ended up being the narrative. Yeah. And of course, it could have gone in a different direction, but the interesting point is how these liberalisation processes since the 80s have weakened Labour to such a point that it's been incapable of taking advantage of the crisis to shift the policy debate. So I take that on board. I think that's a really, really useful perspective. When it comes to Italy, I'm very wary of answering that question with Julie sitting here in front of me, because and Rick Locke as well know much more about the background to this than I do. Italy does have unemployment insurance, but it's a rag bag of policies. There's no systematic universalistic unemployment insurance. So there are measures. But the reasons why Italy ended up with that particular mix are, well, Julie explains it very nicely in her book. This combination of clientelistic politics, which has made it very difficult to develop a universalistic kind of welfare state, which ends up biasing spending in the direction of groups that were powerful, at the time these policies were set up. Not necessarily powerful now. It's interesting to think about the power of autonomous Marxists in Italy. Not only is the Italian Communist Party no more, there is no Italian left party anymore of any description. The radical left is it's currently out of parliament. And the moderate left, if you like, has become a party which is called the Democratic Party, Partito Democratico, and is quite explicitly aiming to become like the American Democratic Party, which by the standards of the Italian left would be considered to be somewhere to the right of Berlusconi. So the left has disappeared from Italy. And it's not even a question of reviving autonomous Marxists anymore. It's a question of reviving any kind of social democracy or any kind of progressive thinking which might hang on to some of these labour rights and welfare rights that have been accumulated over the post-war period. So a council of despair, I'm afraid. Yeah. Oh, finally, political mobilisation and social movements. I think that's really useful because there has been a social movements response to the crisis in Southern Europe. It hasn't made any impact on the policy process, but it's been very visible, and to the extent that there has been a kind of backlash against neoliberalism, it's taken that form. But unfortunately, it's taken a very vociferous form, and it's had no real political impact. But things are happening. Squares in Spain were occupied for weeks, months. But nothing came out of it, because that particular, I guess I'm old-fashioned, but I think, a good old-fashioned centralized political party with some kind of discipline is a much better way of persuading capital to make concessions than a bunch of kids sitting in a square with their phones texting each other. They can make a big noise, but it's not a sustained form of political pressure, and in fact, the Spanish movement has kind of petered out.
Discussion.
Because see if there's something going on, what's the causality. And I don't know this survey data that you're using, but as a discussant mentioned, if you could actually get a hold of any or even construct a panel, you could measure the evolution of people's preferences over time, whether it's individuals or families or people. I think that would be really, really interesting for us to understand the question that you're interested in. So that's a terrific project. I would just ask you to explore those issues. For Jonathan's excellent project, I think it's really great. I think you did a masterful job sort of clearing three in the most literature before you get into your sort of development of political parties story. And I guess I would ask you to explore two things. One is in the late 70s, there was also literature about political parties are doing their work, and so again, there's Alpha, social movements, or Suzanne Berger wrote this article on politics and anti-politics and what's going to work. So are we just going through cycles of parties are able to play a role in aggregating, other times they're not, and maybe that's what's going on, or is there some sort of secular shift? And finally, I would actually explore the inter-organizational issues of why political parties are unable to embrace these progressive messages as opposed to that they're being crowded out by small groups of wealthy, and certainly true in the United States with money in politics, but at least in Italy, it seems like there isn't a space for a progressive left to say, yeah, the public sector really is out of control, and maybe we have to cut it. And by the way, those kinds of macroeconomic policies are destroying very vibrant, small, medium-sized economy that could be hiring people, and there used to be a lot of mobility between those two sectors. And maybe there's a way of having a conversation where you could acknowledge the weaknesses of the old system while trying to promote something that's new and progressive, but also pro kind of a different class of people.
Responses?
Okay, thank you very much. Those were, I'm just going to start. Those were very thoughtful comments. For the preference, the variation within groups, I think you're absolutely right. I think the literature that I'm basing my conceptualization of insiders outsiders on acknowledges that there's variation within group. With their data, which is data from 2006, which is the single snapshot of time. They look at the variation within the group, and they actually aggregate the preferences or the risk of unemployment by welfare regimes too. So then they look at the variation within welfare regimes, which I think is also a very useful way of looking at this. One of the problems I think that I'm already seeing, and when I will be able to add more data to my project, I will probably find this too, is that if you break it down into groups like this, the sample size for each group becomes pretty small, because I have for each country the sample size is usually about 1,000 people in a year. So then when you look to blue collar old women, you come to a very small sample size. So then you have to consider, how representative. So that's something I'm dealing with too. That's why it would be nice to actually aggregate it, maybe even to welfare regimes, and then look at that. But yes, I'm very aware of that. I think my data allows me to comment on that, of the variation, and see if it even makes sense to group them together in different countries in this divide. The perception of risk, not just towards the average, but also compared to other, that's a really interesting comment. I was wondering if you have a specific group in mind, or if you have something specific in mind what these groups could be comparing themselves to. Shaping the perception, not just unemployment. I think that is a good point, and I'll keep that in mind. That's the problem when you quantify, and this is one of the things that the data allows me to do, is to quantify it in this way. But I'm very sympathetic to ideas of historical narratives, and I think that this is clearly where we see the limits of quantitative analysis with this kind of with this kind of work, because, and this comes back to the longitudinal data question too, there's just no comparative longitudinal data available for the time span that I want to analyze that's comparable over time. I am, for my other project, I'm working on a chapter on Germany where I actually just use national survey data for Germany. I'm going to trace a little more in detail the historical development there. So I can do it for one country, and so maybe it'll be possible to do something like that for this project too, so to get into a little more detail of what the narratives are and what the actual mechanisms on the ground are. For the reverse causality, that's a good point that I'm always struggling with. The way I'm controlling for the influence of party positions over time is that if I do it as a statistical analysis, that it's a time series analysis where I say the preferences come before the party positions, and that's our control for that. But of course, I think the overall climate, especially then if you look at across borders, for example, okay, so what if a policy change happens in Britain? What influence could that have on the Social Democratic Party and maybe preferences in Germany? I think that's a very good question that I'm always cautious about.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I haven't really made my mind up about the cycles or secular shift thing. I think I'm probably tending to think the pessimistic side of me doesn't expect there to be some wave of mobilization coming along soon which would change things. And I think that because collective action in the form of a political party with a set of ideas that allows it to bring together a collective interest spanning the sort of middle and lower half of the income distribution is such a difficult thing to put together that I think the fact that it came about in the post-war period with a lot of other favorable conditions, because I think it's probably hard to sustain that most of the shift to Keynesianism and the welfare state in the 50s and 60s was really about popular pressure. There was quite a lot of it just came from on high because technocrats like Keynes thought it would be a great idea to avoid the world collapsing and destroying itself. So even there, I don't think really you could make the case that mass parties were the cause, or at least the most important cause of those kind of changes. So I think there's a sense in which these are very unstable, very precarious forms of collective action. They're very hard to put together. Once they're up and running, they're very hard to change. And I think that links to your second point, which is that a lot of these parties became locked into defending the interests of defending sometimes the indefensible, certainly in Italy, and have never been able to detach themselves from some of those interests and never been able to. So a lot of these inside or outside the dynamics, I think, reflect this, that parties. The default position is to stick with the insiders. Going for the outsiders is incredibly risky because the outsiders may well not respond. So the safest strategy if you're a party leader is to hang on to the core electorate, even if it's shrinking, because if you alienate the core electorate and then go for appealing to outsiders and the outsiders don't respond, then you're in really deep trouble. So I think there is this, I think the inter-organizational part that you were talking about is incredibly important here. Some parties have done a much better job of adapting than others. There is a lot of variation. The Italian case is terrible because they've managed to sort of stick with the vested interests and adopt neoliberalism at the same time, which is the worst possible combination. And you see a little bit of that in Spain too, where you have a core protected workforce which is overprotected, and then the most precariously employed outsiders in Europe. And actually, as a party strategy, it almost just about worked because the socialists in Spain are much stronger than the left in Italy.
We're already down only to a few minutes, so I'm going to collect questions and then have the panelists respond to all of them. And I saw 3 hands. Julie, you, Rena, and then Martin. There'll be 4. Okay, Julie, you can go first.
Okay, so one of the things that really strikes me about this whole debate is that we're so focused on the hold that neoliberalism has on political imagination and policy preferences of the 1% or the top, 10th of 1%. And it sort of makes sense given the dominant approach to ideas of political science right now, which really discursive institutionalist approach that examines how ideas become embedded in particular groups, organizations, or structures. But I think this makes it really difficult to figure out how to look at the absence of ideas, which really seems to be what's going on the left, without moving to a more functionalist position, which makes us feel old and old-fashioned by a lot of these people, right? So we don't want to feel old. sort of the flip side of the stronghold that neoliberal ideas and policies have. I think Ancha's work may be able to shed some light on that, at least by showing us what parties are responding to at the level of the electorate in terms of policy preferences. I think we also need to understand meso-level organizational dynamics within parties and unions. And Jonathan, that's really kind of where I want to push you to go with this project. It's really thinking about what is happening, what are common trends, what nationally specific things are happening at the level of parties, unions, and other organizations of the left that can help us understand why they're having so much trouble mounting a defense against neoliberalism.
Thanks. I have to ask you to all to be brief now, please.
My question is to Professor in some of the works that you presented on your website, you spoke of the rejectment of the leadership of the board majority and how they have to convince their group to work very hard for what they get for free. I wonder if you speak as much as you could about that argument that you presented in your work. It will really set the tone for today's conference. And I wonder if you think the effect of the relative deprivation on that argument. Should I read that question?
I'm not sure I got that exactly.
Yes, in your work, you spoke of the problem that the board majority in welfare society have. They have to convince their groups, their individuals, to work hard for the things that they get for free. The majority of the board in America, they are getting so much Section 8 and all this stuff. So in order to improve the stats and things, I think you presented this argument very well in a layman term in one of your work. I didn't mention it, but it's zero. So it's so relevant to today's argument. And also, I wonder if you think that the effect of the relative deprivation on how the whole thing, now we teach relative deprivation. It's not so far, we have to be equal, not to have, we have to be equal to that, so that's the question.
Just leave it at that, Rena.
Brief question for Ante. I wondered how the conversation of flexicurity might shape your definitions of insider and outsider. So in your presentation, I think you define outsider as the risk of unemployment or atypical employment. But your questions, at least the samples, were all about unemployment. And I'm curious if we get into a mode where flexibility and movement, what you're calling, I think what you're calling atypical employment is the mainstream, then how do we redefine inside and outside?
Martin?
Yes, and she was referring to me, and risk. How risky is it for us?
Yeah, I'm asking the paper. Could you say a little bit more about how you see the interaction between ideas and political parties? For me, you say it's a bit of austerity percentage that most countries adopted, also followed, but has there not been some difference, at least in the pace of change in Britain as opposed to earlier? Most we're seeing, arguably, are exactly policies that conservative government would have implemented anyway. It was the crisis was not opportunity for them to do whatever they wanted to do anyway. So would it be a difference if not new labor, but Miliband kind of labor had been in power at the time of the downturn? Do you think that's a benefit?
Okay. I'll start with the flexicurity question. Yes, that was very perceptive. I left it out on purpose because my data that I was going to present today doesn't allow me to look at atypical employment, because the way that Schwander and Häusermann define it is part-time jobs that's involuntarily. And I do not have the necessary questions to see if I can talk about part-time, but not if people choose to be in part-time positions or not. And so I will add that measure. That was one of the next steps that I'm going to do. I will add that measure by looking at national survey data where that question is asked, and then I can come up with the risk of being in atypical employment. And I think especially for certain groups like women, this is going to be a very valuable contribution to this, that not just looking at unemployment, but the risk of atypical employment after, for example, having children and coming back to the labor force and being forced to be in some kind of part-time employment, for example. So yes, I'm aware of that and I will add to it, and I think that's going to be a better measure than just reducing unemployment.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah, I think absence of ideas is a good way of putting it, because I think quite a lot of the time left parties, if you look at France, for example, you get the clear sensation that Hollande knew what people wanted to hear, but didn't have any idea really what kind of policies to put in place, and seems to be totally confused really now. There doesn't seem to be any real pattern to any real strategy. A strategy to get elected, but no governing strategy. So I think you're right. I think there's an extent to which left parties are sticking with neoliberal policies because they don't really know what else to do, and they also know that that pleases certain stakeholders as well. So they know the kind of people who might be upset. But I think also, I get that, so if we take the case of the Labour Party, and also I think the Democrats and the left Democrats in Italy too, now Democratic Party, what you get, it's very difficult for the same politician to start telling a different story. I have a student working on Gordon Brown's political rhetoric, and she shows how Gordon Brown had real trouble with the financial crisis because it blew out of the water everything that he'd been saying for 20 years to build a Labour's governing strategy around. And he couldn't just simply change his tune. So a lot of it is about turnover and the level of the elites of these parties. Actually, in the Labour Party in Britain now, Ed Miliband's taken over and he's pushing a slightly different line. But he's having to deal with people in the party who really don't want that different line. They want to stick to a Blairite kind of strategy, and there's a real battle going on in the party. So I think this speaks to the kind of things that both of you were hinting at here. And I think Martin's point is right, that which party happens to be in charge at the time makes a big difference, because one of the big patterns in Europe is that if you exclude Germany and Sweden, who, you know, in the initial phase of the crisis were in a better state than all the other countries, basically given parties have all been defeated. Whenever they stood for election, they've lost. In Greece, it's happened 3 times, actually. You know, whoever happens to be governing is like this, you know, this bomb that they're carrying, you know, it blows up in your face, whatever policies you follow. So I think it does make a difference who ends up governing. In Spain it was Zapatero, in Britain it was Labour, so the people who got to take over were Conservatives, and because of the nature of the electoral systems there were majorities and they were able to follow these policies. So that certainly fits in with what these parties would have wanted to do anyway, that's true. But the real challenge is to explain why when parties of the left get a chance to govern, they can't do anything different. PASOK in Greece, for example, found itself completely lost when it took over in 2009, and now practically it doesn't exist anymore. So, yeah, but I think Julie's appeal to this kind of more fine-grained analysis of what's actually going on in political parties, the elites in the parties, how they relate to people in other organizations that sort of backstop progressive ideas, I think that's crucial. I'll get back to you in the break and explore this idea further.
And that reminds us that it's a few minutes into our break, so we should pause now, resume as close as we can to 10:45, and now thank the panel for the